Death at Gallows Green, Chapter 26. In the last half of the 19th century, a wave of investigative curiosity broke over the world, a need to examine, to weigh, to measure, to know definitively. This new vision slowly began to affect methods of detection and the new science of criminology. When Sherlock Holmes employed a magnifying glass to scrutinize a flake of Latakia tobacco discovered on the Smyrna rock in the Boscombe Valley affair, and spoke of having written a little monograph on the 140 varieties of tobacco ash, he was not just speaking as a fictional detective. He was a proponent of the scientific method in the investigation of crime. Martin DeLisi, Science and the Detective. Lawrence must have hoped that his trip to Bishop's Keep would serve more than one purpose, for when the valet returned that evening he was deeply perturbed. Charles, who was clearing off the small table in the bedroom where his microscope sat, smiled a little. "You have seen the fair Amelia, I suppose?" Lawrence held out a brown paper parcel. "It don't bear talking about it, sir," he said with dignity. Charles took the parcel, regretting that his question had been so lightly and unfeelingly phrased. "Were you prevented from seeing her?" Frustration was written across Lawrence's face, mixed with disappointment. "It's the housekeeper," he growled. "Mrs. Pratt. She don't want Amelia seeing me." "On account of what happened the last time you were together?" Lawrence's lip curled slightly. "On account of Mrs. Pratt's narrow-minded old misery, what cares more for appearances than for what's true?" "I know Mrs. Pratt a little," Charles said. "My impression is that of a woman intent on doing her duty. Perhaps if I spoke with her, or better," he paused, considering, "or better with Miss Ardley, under the appropriate circumstances, there might not be any objection to you seeing the girl. With supervision, of course." Lawrence shook his head sadly. "No disrespect, sir," he said, "but how would you like to do courting with some sharp-eyed old woman looking at on as telling you mind where to put your hands?" Charles sighed. Not likely to be doing any courting at all, at least not in the immediate future. Miss Ardley seemed to have a surfeit of suitors, but Lawrence's point was well taken. "I will see what I can do." Lawrence thanked him and was leaving the room when Charles thought of something and caught him back. "Do you happen to know Tommy Brock?" he asked, "the brother-in-law of McGregor, the assistant gamekeeper." Lawrence's face grew dark. "Old Tommy? Do I know him? He's a bugger, he's Tommy. You don't want to run afoul of him in a dark night." "Is that right?" Charles asked with interest. "What can you tell me about the man?" What Lawrence could tell, it turned out, both was and was not material to the matter at hand. He and Tommy Brock had been acquainted before Lawrence came to work at Marston Manor, when he was a manservant in the home of a certain Mr. Dalton, a wealthy ship owner in Manningtree. Tommy Brock was an agent in Dalton's shipping business. He was given to gambling at cards and had covered his losses from Dalton's receipts. When the money was discovered missing, however, there was not sufficient evidence to take him before the magistrate, so he was discharged with a stern warning. He had remained in the area, doing whatever work he could find and applying frequently to his sister for assistance. "Do you know where he lives?" Charles asked. Lawrence shrugged. "Mayhap McGregor knows, or Mrs. McGregor. Or you might ask her him at the Live and Let Live on a Saturday night. He's usually there." When Lawrence had gone, Charles laid the parcel on the bed and opened it. Inside, neatly folded, was the jacket Artie had been wearing when he was shot, the bloodstain on the front left breast still matted with seeds and what looked like bits of grass stem. But when Charles scraped off a sample and looked at it under a microscope, he saw that what he had taken to be grass stems were the broken pieces of thick, golden stems of wheat. The seeds were certainly threshed grains of wheat. He went back to the jacket to investigate further. There were pockets, one on each side and one on the right breast. When he carefully turned each one out onto a sheet of paper, he found a great deal more grain. So much, in fact, that he could only conclude that it had not gotten to the pockets when Artie was shot and fell to the ground. It looked as if Artie had deliberately scooped a handful of grain into each pocket. Why would he do such a thing? What was there about the grain that made it worth keeping? Charles spent the next few minutes with his microscope giving cursory examination to the grain from each pocket. What he saw both puzzled and intrigued him. The material in each sample, mostly wheat seeds and a few other seeds and some chaff, appeared to differ substantially from the material in the other two samples. Artie had somehow managed to acquire samples from 3 different sources. How had he done this? Why? Did this material hold any clue to the reason for his death, or to the identity of his murderer? These questions intrigued Charles to such an extent that he spent the next several hours, until well after midnight, performing what he was accustomed to call a population analysis, a technique he had developed in his work in paleontology. In studying different rock strata, he learned that the populations of different organisms varied from strata to strata. The strata could be compared by identifying and counting the organisms. Using the same technique, he carefully sorted the grain, seeds, and other materials, mostly bits of grass and stem. When he had finished and recorded his results, he had a profile of each sample. So many grains of wheat, so many round brown seeds, so many pointed yellow-green seeds, so many tiny burrs, and so on. When Charles compared the material in each sample to the other 2, he discovered something equally intriguing. The grains of wheat from Artie's breast pocket were fuller and more round than the grains of wheat from his right pocket, while the grains from the left pocket were much darker in color and heavier. In one sample there were yellow-green seeds but no burrs. In another, many burrs but no yellow and green seeds. The conclusion was clear. Artie Oliver had carefully filled each of his 3 pockets with 3 very different samples of grain, so different, in fact, that the contents of each pocket might have come from a different field, perhaps even a different farm. For a moment, Charles stood staring down at what he had found. What on earth was Artie doing with all this grain in his pocket? Where had he got it? But the grain yielded no answer, and the longer Charles stared, the less distinctly he saw. And when he finally lay across the bed and fell asleep, he dreamed of Artie Oliver tramping from field to field, filling his pocket as he went.